The night was colder than he expected. Through the thin blanket issued at the camp, Hans Bauer pressed his pen against the paper, the ink trembling under his grip. He wrote in hesitant strokes, not knowing if the letter would ever find its way across the ocean, past the censors, into the hands of his wife in Hamburg. "Anna," he began, "they let us walk under the sun today. The guards joked with us. And the food, Anna, the food is more than I have seen in years. I do not understand this place." Bauer had been captured in Tunisia in May 1943, part of the mass surrender of Axis forces crushed between British and American armies. Like many Wehrmacht soldiers, he had been fed endless stories of the United States, a nation of mongrels riven by strikes, where weak leadership and capitalist greed made collapse inevitable. They were told that America had no true culture, no real strength, only material excess bound to corrode from within. Yet within weeks of arriving on American soil, Bauer's world began to fracture. The first shock had been the voyage itself. The Liberty ship that ferried him across the Atlantic seemed a machine from another planet. Vast, steel ribs humming, radar dishes rotating. The sailors moved with casual confidence. They drank coffee with sugar, ate meat daily, tossed aside food that would have been luxuries back home. For men who had fought in the deserts on starvation rations, this abundance was impossible to reconcile. How could the enemy afford to treat its own sailors so well while still supplying an army across two oceans? When the ship docked in Virginia, Bauer saw something that unsettled him even more. The port stretched endlessly, cranes moving cargo in rhythm, trucks roaring, locomotives pulling lines of freight cars longer than entire German towns. In Hamburg, he had seen docks crippled by bombs and shortages. Here, every direction screamed of plenty. Most disturbing was not the scale of the machinery but the civilians. Women in dresses walked freely among the piers, men laughed with them without fear of censors or police. Bauer whispered to a fellow prisoner, "Are we certain we are at war with this place?" The convoy of trains that carried them inland confirmed the nightmare. The carriages were not cattle wagons, but passenger coaches with padded seats, electric lights, even dining cars. Bauer remembered nights spent crouched in muddy ditches in Russia, clutching black bread frozen solid. Now he stared at waiters serving steaming plates to civilians in wartime. He thought of Goebbels' radio voice, warning of American decay, and felt the lie coil tighter around his stomach. The train rolled through small towns that to Bauer looked like impossible dreams. Neon lights glowed above drugstores. Gasoline stations dotted every roadside, each with multiple pumps. Even rural farms had tractors gleaming under electric flood lamps. Children in clean clothes rode bicycles along paved streets. The prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, silent. Some cursed softly, others crossed themselves. They had been told America was fragile. Instead, they were seeing a society so abundant that even its smallest corners surpassed the German cities they had left behind. When the train finally slowed into the camp's siding, Bauer braced himself for what he thought must surely come next: barbed wire, harsh guards, punishment. Yet as he stepped down, the air smelled of cut grass, and American soldiers offered cigarettes before ordering them to line up. The camp itself was plain: barracks, fences, watchtowers, but astonishingly clean. Electric bulbs burned in every building. Water poured hot from showers. In the mess hall, white bread sat in baskets on every table beside pitchers of milk. It was the bread that undid him. For months, Bauer had eaten coarse slices stretched with sawdust, bitter on the tongue. Now he tore into a piece of soft, white loaf so light it seemed unreal. He chewed slowly, eyes wet. Around him, other prisoners murmured the same word again and again: unglaublich. Unbelievable. The first night, as the barracks lights clicked off one by one, Bauer lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. He thought of the promises carved into banners back in Germany: order, unity, sacrifice. He thought of Anna, queuing for hours for potatoes, clutching ration cards worth less each month. And he thought of the guards outside, laughing with each other, smoking freely, unafraid of denunciation. For the first time he asked himself whether the fatherland had told him the truth. By morning the question gnawed deeper. Outside the fence, American farmers plowed fields with tractors that roared like tanks. Yet no Gestapo officer stalked them, no posters screamed slogans from the barn walls. The farmers worked, earned, lived. Bauer muttered to a fellow prisoner, "They seem freer in wartime than we did in peace." That was the paradox that would haunt thousands of German prisoners scattered across America. They had come as soldiers of a regime that promised 1,000 years of destiny. Yet behind barbed wire, they discovered something more destabilizing than defeat. They discovered freedom, not through lectures or propaganda films, but in the casual abundance of ordinary Americans. For Bauer and many others, captivity became revelation. And the question lingered in every letter, every diary entry smuggled past the censors. If America could grant such dignity to its enemies, what did that say about the world they had left behind? On the third morning in the compound, Bauer was startled awake by a whistle. Not the sharp bark of an order, not the metallic snap of boots on concrete, but a casual sound, half command, half invitation. The gates opened, guards gestured lazily for the prisoners to form a line. No rifles shoved against their chests, no snarled curses in their ears. What unsettled Bauer most was not brutality but its absence. He had prepared for pain, humiliation, and endless suspicion. What he faced instead was something stranger: indifference. Back home, every pamphlet and radio broadcast had painted the Americans as ruthless. If captured, they said, you would be starved, worked to death, or simply shot as an inconvenience. Bauer had carried those images in his head through the long Atlantic voyage. Yet here, the first breakfast tray slid across the counter held fried eggs, strips of bacon, white bread soft as clouds, and a steaming mug of coffee. He stared at it as though it were a cruel joke. "This must be for the guards," a fellow prisoner muttered under his breath. The American behind the counter only shrugged and replied, "For you. Eat." The dining hall filled with the clatter of utensils, with muffled sighs of relief, with laughter that sounded almost insane, laughter that proved, if only for a moment, that they were still alive. Some men wept as they swallowed, the taste of butter and coffee overwhelming after years of scarcity. To eat like this as captives was a kind of insult to everything they had been told. That afternoon Bauer was assigned to light duty outside the fence, trimming grass, repainting the kitchen barracks. The tools were blunt, the work was simple, and the guards watched without menace. Under the wide Midwestern sky, he saw no bombers overhead, no smoke columns on the horizon, no ruins where cities should be. Only sunlight, cicadas, and the quiet rhythm of brushes against wood. He caught himself thinking that this silence was more alien than war itself. The days took on a rhythm that unsettled him further. Wake with the whistle, line up without hurry, eat meals that tasted far better than the rations he had known in uniform. Work but never to exhaustion. Read if one could find an English newspaper or a tattered book. And always the astonishing fact: the guards did not scream. They joked, sometimes even smiled. One lanky American with a crooked cap would lean against the fence and talk about baseball, the words half lost on Bauer but the tone unmistakably light. The prisoners tried to make sense of it in whispers at night. Some claimed it was a trick: fatten them up, soften their spirits, then exploit them. Others said America was simply so rich it could afford to waste good food on enemies. Bauer listened, uncertain. In his bones he still expected cruelty. Yet every plate of food, every easy gesture of a guard chipped away at that expectation. One evening he saw something that left him unsettled in a different way. A truck rolled through the gate carrying fresh supplies. Among the crates were cans of peaches, bags of flour, even cartons of cigarettes. The guards unloaded half for themselves and then, without hesitation, passed the rest to the kitchen staff for the prisoners. Bauer remembered the numbers he had once heard whispered among officers. America produced more than 20 billion pounds of canned food in a single year of war. Source needed. That number had sounded absurd, exaggerated propaganda. But here it was in flesh and tin, abundance so vast that even prisoners of war could taste it. At night Bauer lay awake on his bunk, the air thick with the smell of hay stuffing and sweat. He thought about home, about his sister standing in line for bread, about the cracked potatoes his mother once saved from rot. He thought about the black market coffee substitute brewed from acorns. And then he thought about the mug of real coffee he had set down half-finished that very morning, simply because there had been too much. The guilt and the wonder twisted together until he could hardly breathe. The camp itself was not paradise. The fences were real, the watchtowers real, the knowledge of captivity heavy. There were fights among the prisoners, outbreaks of despair, men who carved graffiti into the wood with knives hidden from the guards. Yet compared to what they had braced for, it was another world. When the mail arrived, Bauer was allowed to write a letter. His hand shook as he tried to choose words. What could he say? That he was alive, that he was well-fed? To admit such things might sound like betrayal. Yet to hide them felt like lying. He wrote simply, I am healthy. I work in the sun. Do not worry. The contradictions pressed harder each day. Bauer had been trained to believe he was fighting for a superior civilization. Yet here, behind barbed wire, he found roofs that did not leak, food that did not vanish, and guards who did not spit. He walked through the compound with the uneasy sense that the world outside was larger and kinder than the one inside his own head. By the end of that first week, Bauer realized that captivity was not what would break him. It was comparison. The longer he lived under the lazy whistles and the smell of bacon, the more impossible it became to hold on to the picture of America he had been given. Reality had intruded, and it carried the taste of coffee, the sight of wide skies, and the unbearable weight of doubt. The first time Bauer left the camp gates, he felt his chest tighten as though a trap were about to spring. A guard motioned for him and several others to climb onto a flatbed truck. The wooden boards rattled as the engine started. For weeks, they had seen only the inside of the compound, a miniature world of dust, barbed wire, and regulated meals. Now the truck rolled past the outer guard post, past the double fence, into a countryside that opened like a book he had never read. He expected suspicion from the villagers, anger in their eyes. Instead, he saw children waving from porches, women in cotton dresses carrying groceries, men in overalls driving tractors across fields that looked endless. The truck stopped beside a barn, and an American farmer with a straw hat strode forward, shaking hands with the guards as though they were neighbors, not soldiers. The prisoners were given shovels and baskets. The job was to harvest potatoes, haul them from the soil into sacks. Bauer's hands, calloused from years in uniform, found the work familiar yet strangely comforting. He remembered the thin rows of his mother's garden, where each potato had felt like a victory. Here the earth gave them up in abundance. Sacks filled quickly. Carts groaned under the weight. And there were always more. At noon, the farmer's wife appeared with a jug of water so cold the glass sweated in the sun. She handed tin cups directly to the prisoners. Bauer hesitated, but the guard nodded. He drank. The water was clear, pure, and free. No price, no suspicion. He swallowed greedily until his chest ached, and when he lowered the cup he realized the woman had already turned away, treating him not as a captive but as a worker in the field. In whispers that night, men argued about what they had seen. Some insisted it was staged, Americans parading their wealth for propaganda. But Bauer shook his head. The farm had not been a stage, the soil was too real, the sweat on his brow too familiar. If America could afford to share its harvest with enemy soldiers, what did that mean for the war? A figure loomed large in their conversations. The sheer industrial muscle of the United States. One prisoner recalled numbers he had overheard from a guard. America had built more than 300,000 planes during the war years. Source needed. Another had read, in an English newspaper smuggled through the fence, that the country produced enough steel each year to rebuild entire nations. Bauer thought of the fields stretching beyond the horizon, the barns bursting with grain, the farms that seemed untouched by scarcity. It was as if America were fighting the war with one hand while feeding itself, its allies, and even its prisoners with the other. The effect on morale was corrosive, though few admitted it aloud. To concede America's strength was to question the very foundation of their loyalty. Yet doubt spread in small gestures. A man chewing slowly on white bread, staring into space, another folding the wrapper of an American cigarette as though it were sacred. For Bauer, the crack widened one evening when he overheard a guard talking to the farmer about wages. The farmer complained about rising costs. The guard laughed and said, "At least we've got the manpower now." He jerked a thumb toward the prisoners. They were not slaves, not victims. They were labor, cheap, temporary, but still treated with a kind of transactional respect. Back in Germany, Bauer had seen prisoners too. Russians, Poles, men dragged into work camps under the whip. They had been shadows, gaunt and silent, their eyes downcast. To be on the other side of that image, and to be handed water, to be paid in cigarettes, was to feel the moral weight shifting beneath his feet. One night he wrote in his journal, careful to keep the pages hidden, "I fear the truth is greater than we were told. Here even the farms are factories of plenty. If this is the enemy, how can we ever overcome them?" The words frightened him more than the guards' rifles ever could. The rhythm of farm work continued for weeks. Some days it was corn, other days apples, their skins shining red in the baskets. The prisoners joked quietly in German, teasing each other, competing over who could haul more. The guards watched but did not intervene. It felt almost like a parody of freedom, moving beyond the fence, sweating under the sun, laughing like men again. Then, at the end of the day, the truck would rumble back, carrying them into captivity once more. And always, Bauer noticed the motif of food. Food was the silent teacher, the constant evidence. The bread soft, the milk fresh, the meat plentiful. Every meal reminded him of what Germany had lost. The hunger, the ration cards, the thin soups. Numbers came alive in every bite. He recalled hearing that Germany had cut civilian rations to half a pound of meat per week in 1942, source needed. By contrast, here he was, an enemy soldier, eating meat more often than his family back home. The contrast gnawed at him. He wanted to believe it was temporary, that the tide of war would turn, that his homeland still stood proud. But with each passing day the illusion thinned. The fences of the camp no longer symbolized captivity. They symbolized a barrier between the world he had imagined and the one he could no longer deny. When Bauer closed his eyes at night, he no longer dreamed of battlefields. He dreamed of bread, thick slices, buttered, shared without fear. And he wondered whether the war, for him, had already been lost the moment he tasted that first cup of American coffee. The first time Bauer saw a motion picture in the camp, he nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Prisoners, men who had marched under the swastika, now sat in rows on wooden benches while an American projector hummed behind them. The canvas sheet flickered to life. On screen, cowboys galloped across endless plains, guns flashing, dust rising. The prisoners watched, mouths half open. It was not propaganda, not newsreels of speeches or battle victories. It was entertainment, offered to men who only weeks earlier had been trying to kill the nation that now entertained them. Bauer squinted at the electric light dancing across the faces of his comrades. For years, German propaganda had painted America as chaotic, weak, polluted by decadence. And yet here was decadence in its purest form, storytelling for no reason other than joy. The guards leaned against the wall, chuckling at the jokes, chewing gum, relaxed. The film ended with applause, not from the guards but from the prisoners themselves. Bauer felt the clap of his own hands before he realized what he was doing. The shocks continued outside the theater. The camp distributed newspapers. Censored, yes, but still brimming with stories of American towns, sports scores, advertisements for cars, refrigerators, even radios. Bauer devoured them. He traced his finger along the photographs of smiling families standing in front of brand new Buicks. In Germany, only party officials and generals could dream of such luxuries. Here, the average worker's garage seemed to overflow with abundance. One article described baseball, a game Bauer had never understood. Yet the tone struck him. An entire nation following a sport, filling stadiums, investing passion not in war but in leisure. Another page advertised a local grocery store sale, coffee, sugar, butter, all available in quantities unthinkable in Europe. The prisoners whispered among themselves, was it possible? Could civilians here really eat better than German officers? On Sundays the camp allowed religious services. Bauer, raised Catholic but long hardened by war, attended out of curiosity. The chapel was simple, but the priest spoke softly about forgiveness, about the duty to care even for enemies. Sitting there, surrounded by fellow soldiers in worn uniforms, Bauer felt the weight of those words. The guards stood respectfully at the back, heads bowed during prayer. It was a small act, but it carried more power than any propaganda film he had ever seen. Occasionally, groups of prisoners were taken into town under escort for work or errands. Bauer remembered stepping off a train in a small Midwestern town, expecting to be met with jeers. Instead, he smelled fresh bread from a bakery, heard jazz spilling from a diner, saw children chasing one another across sidewalks. No rubble, no hunger, no blackout curtains. Shops gleamed with goods that Germans had forgotten existed. Shoes in every size, radios stacked in displays, fruit piled high in baskets. A woman passed with 2 grocery bags, each bulging with meat and bread. She did not even glance at the prisoners, as if their presence was unremarkable. Bauer wanted to shout after her, "Do you not know who I am? Do you not hate me?" But she disappeared into the crowd, free, unconcerned, carrying abundance as if it were ordinary. The psychological impact of such scenes could not be measured in rations or wages. They chipped at the very foundation of belief. For years, Nazi rhetoric had painted Germany as the stronghold of order, discipline, and destiny, while America was portrayed as corrupt, materialistic, a society of mongrels. Yet here was corruption that looked suspiciously like prosperity, materialism that looked suspiciously like happiness. Bauer began to notice small rebellions among the men. Some practiced English phrases, trading with guards for comic books or chewing gum. Others saved cigarette rations not for smoking but for barter, imitating the American system of exchange. A few even drew sketches of American barns and tractors, marveling at their design. It was as though captivity itself had become a classroom, each day a lecture in the reality of American life. One night, a fellow prisoner named Kruger confided in Bauer. His voice was low, but the urgency in his tone betrayed him. "Do you see it too? The waste, the comfort. They throw away food as though it were nothing. My mother writes of standing in line for bread. Here they leave half a loaf on the table. Tell me, is this not proof that everything we were told was a lie?" Bauer hesitated. Admitting doubt felt dangerous even among comrades. Yet the question gnawed at him. He thought of the children waving from porches, of the guards sharing cigarettes, of the white bread on his plate. Finally he whispered back, "Yes. It is proof." From that moment, Bauer understood that he was fighting 2 wars, one with barbed wire and uniforms, the other within his own mind. Each shock, each glimpse of American life, tilted the scales further. What struck him most was the ordinary. It was not the tanks or planes, though rumors of their numbers were staggering. It was the sight of families driving to church in automobiles, the hum of electricity in every house, the ease with which people lived. To Bauer, freedom no longer meant a slogan shouted by party leaders. It meant a light bulb glowing in a farmhouse window, a child eating ice cream on a summer street, a guard who shared his cigarette without hesitation. In his hidden journal he wrote, "We believed strength came from fear, from control, from marching in unison. But here I see strength in disorder, shops filled with goods, people laughing, workers treated as equals. Perhaps freedom is the true weapon. If so, it is a weapon we cannot match." The journal pages filled quickly. Words spilled like confessions, each one both terrifying and liberating. Bauer no longer feared the guards' rifles. He feared the truth that America revealed with every ordinary kindness. By the winter of 1944 he could no longer dismiss it as illusion. America's abundance was not staged. Its freedom was not chaos. And for a German prisoner who had once believed in conquest, that realization was the sharpest wound of all. By early 1944 the camp felt less like a cage and more like a mirror. Every day reflected a contrast so sharp it cut into the prisoners' minds. The Germans had arrived believing themselves chosen, armored in discipline and ideology. But each passing week in America chipped away at that armor, leaving hairline cracks that no officer's speech could repair. Bauer noticed the change most during mealtimes. At first, the men devoured everything in silence, their hunger drowning out thought. But over time, conversations returned, about food, about family, about the war. They debated the butter on the table, the cigarettes in their pockets. A loaf of bread was no longer just sustenance. It was evidence, proof that the world outside Germany operated on a different set of laws. Some men resisted. There were prisoners who still saluted with rigid spines, who muttered about American tricks, who insisted the Reich remained strong. They spoke of new weapons, of hidden victories, of Berlin's unbreakable will. But even their voices grew strained when faced with reality. A man could chant slogans, yet hunger and memory told a different story. Bauer watched one such loyalist, a corporal named Reiner, sit with his tray untouched one evening. Reiner stared at the plate of roast beef, the mound of potatoes, the slice of pie glistening with syrup. "This is unnatural," he whispered, fists clenched. "They want us weak with comfort." But he ate every bite. The psychological war raged inside the fence and the Americans knew it. They did not shout ideology, they demonstrated it. Guards laughed openly, argued about baseball scores, complained about the weather. They treated prisoners not as enemies but as inconveniences, laborers to be managed. The very indifference carried power. For a man raised in a culture of fear and suspicion, indifference was its own revelation. The turning point came in September 1943, when Italy signed the armistice. News spread quickly through the camp. Italian prisoners, once fellow captives, suddenly became co-belligerents. They were offered the chance to join Italian service units, working alongside Americans in non-combat roles. And astonishingly, tens of thousands volunteered. Bauer watched Italians leave the camp, donning uniforms stitched with a small Italy patch. They marched out with smiles, some even shaking hands with guards. To the Germans it felt like betrayal. Reiner spat on the ground, muttering curses. But Bauer felt something else. Envy. The Italians were moving toward freedom, while the Germans remained shackled not by chains, but by their own stubborn pride. That envy grew sharper when news from Europe filtered through. Letters from home, censored but revealing nonetheless, spoke of bombings, shortages, cities reduced to rubble. Bauer's own mother wrote of standing in endless queues for bread, of neighbors lost in air raids. She begged him to survive, to return when the nightmare was over. Her words carried desperation he had never seen before. Meanwhile in America, Bauer saw farms brimming with crops, factories belching smoke from 3 shifts of workers, shops stocked with goods. The juxtaposition was unbearable. He began to wonder if survival itself meant more than loyalty to a crumbling Reich. Some prisoners responded by clinging tighter to ideology. They held secret meetings, whispering about escape, about holding true until Germany triumphed. They carved swastikas into wooden bunks, painted slogans on hidden scraps of cloth. But fewer men attended those gatherings as months passed. Others drifted in the opposite direction. They practiced English, sang American songs learned from guards, even traded sketches of pin-up girls clipped from magazines. Bauer found himself in this second group, though he never admitted it aloud. He studied English words by candlelight, scribbling phrases in his journal. Freedom, opportunity, dignity. One night, Kruger asked him directly, "Do you still believe we will win?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Bauer hesitated, then answered softly, "No. But I believe we might survive." The line between belief and survival became the camp's true divide. For those still devoted to ideology, captivity was humiliation. For those shifting toward reality, captivity was a window, a painful but undeniable glimpse into another world. The Americans, perhaps unintentionally, deepened this transformation. They allowed lectures, vocational classes, even art workshops. Bauer attended one on agriculture, curious about the machines that seemed to dominate every American field. The instructor, a civilian farmer brought in for the day, explained crop rotation, soil chemistry, the efficiency of tractors. Bauer scribbled notes furiously, imagining his mother's small garden in Germany transformed by such methods. It dawned on him that America's strength was not only its weapons or factories, but its knowledge. Ordinary farmers spoke with confidence about yields that dwarfed anything in Europe. Students debated freely in classrooms. Even guards argued openly with one another without fear of punishment. Knowledge flowed here, unrestricted, unchained. That freedom of thought was perhaps the greatest shock of all. In Germany, Bauer had learned to measure every word, to weigh silence against danger. Here, even within the fences, speech was lighter, freer. Prisoners argued with guards and received only laughter in return. Men criticized their own officers in whispers that grew bolder each week. The camp itself began to feel like a crossroads. On one path lay loyalty to the Reich, brittle and demanding, promising only eventual collapse. On the other lay a strange, uncertain respect for the enemy, born not from persuasion but from lived experience. Bauer stood at that crossroads each night, staring at the wire fence glowing faintly under floodlights. Beyond it stretched a land of abundance, a land that treated even its prisoners with more dignity than his homeland had shown its own people. He thought of his mother's letters, of his comrades' hollow eyes, of the laughter of American guards drifting through the night. And he wondered, though he never said it aloud, whether he had already crossed the line in his heart. The summer of 1944 brought with it a tremor that shook even the safest corners of captivity. On the morning of June 7th, rumors rippled through the camp like wildfire. The Allies had landed in France. D-Day. Normandy. A second front. At first the news seemed impossible. For years Germany had held Fortress Europe, its defenses supposedly impregnable. The Atlantic Wall, the party had boasted, would never fall. And yet here were the Americans, the British, the Canadians, pouring onto French beaches under fire, establishing a foothold. The Americans didn't hide it. Within days, newspapers confirmed the invasion, splashing maps across the front page. Prisoners crowded around the bulletin boards, tracing the arrows with their fingers. Some scoffed, insisting it was exaggeration, a temporary raid soon to be crushed. Others fell silent, eyes dark with recognition. Bauer felt his stomach twist. He remembered marching into France in 1940, the ease of that victory, the pride that had seemed unshakable. Now, only 4 years later, the tide had turned so completely that Allied armies were landing where Germans once paraded. He thought of his mother's letters, of shortages, of the bombings she described. And he realized, the Reich was shrinking, its reach retreating day by day. The camp responded in strange ways. Some men doubled down on loyalty, convinced that Germany would unleash secret weapons to reverse the tide. They spoke in hushed tones about rockets, about jets, about some ultimate solution that would sweep the Allies back into the sea. But others, many others, began to breathe differently. D-Day was proof, undeniable, that liberation was coming. Not liberation for them, not yet, but liberation for Europe, for their families trapped under endless war. For the first time, Bauer heard men whisper not about Germany's strength, but about its possible surrender. One evening, the camp loudspeaker played a radio broadcast. President Roosevelt's voice filled the air, calm, confident, assuring the American people that the invasion was the beginning of the end. Prisoners sat on their bunks, listening in silence. For Bauer, the words carried more than propaganda, they carried certainty. The Americans believed in victory not as an ambition but as a fact. And belief, Bauer realized, could be as powerful as any weapon. Daily life in the camp reflected the shift. Guards, once indifferent, now walked with a spring in their step. They read headlines with pride, slapped each other on the back, joked about the war ending soon. Their confidence seeped through the wire, infecting the prisoners. At the same time, censorship of letters grew harsher. Many of Bauer's mother's sentences were blacked out, reduced to fragments. Bombings, shortages, praying for your safety. The blanks were louder than the words. He knew what they hid: despair, hunger, the collapse of a nation stretched beyond its limits. One night, Bauer lay awake, listening to Kruger breathe in the bunk above. Finally, he whispered, "Do you think we will ever go home?" Kruger shifted, then answered, "Not to the same home. Germany will not be the same when we return." That truth stung. Bauer had once fought for glory, for conquest, for the idea of a fatherland destined to dominate. Now he longed only for survival, for a chance to see his mother again, even if it meant returning to a shattered homeland. The Americans seemed to understand this quiet shift. They organized lectures on democracy, inviting prisoners to attend. Some scoffed, calling it propaganda. But Bauer sat in the back, listening. The lecturer spoke of freedom, of government by the people, of a system that allowed disagreement without fear. Bauer compared it to the slogans he had memorized back home, the speeches that demanded obedience at every turn. He found himself wondering which system truly commanded strength, the one built on fear or the one built on trust. Meanwhile, work assignments continued. Bauer spent long days in the fields, harvesting wheat under the relentless sun. American farmers drove tractors that dwarfed anything in Germany, machines that seemed to do the work of a dozen men in half the time. Bauer marveled at the efficiency, the abundance. It was no wonder, he thought, that America could fight a war across oceans and still keep its people fed. In quiet moments he caught himself daydreaming. What would it be like to live here, to work these fields, to walk into town not as a prisoner but as a free man? The thought was dangerous, treasonous even, but it crept into his mind nonetheless. Tensions in the camp reflected the war's trajectory. Loyalists accused others of weakness, of betraying Germany with their doubts. Fistfights broke out, broken quickly by guards. The once solid unity of the prisoners fractured under pressure. Some still clung to the idea of final victory. Others secretly prayed for Germany's defeat, if only to end the suffering. Bauer found himself firmly in the latter camp. He no longer believed in the Reich's destiny. He believed only in survival, in the possibility of a different future. D-Day had changed everything. It was not merely a battle, it was proof that the Reich was not invincible, proof that the world beyond the barbed wire was shifting, proof that the prison walls themselves were temporary. In his journal, Bauer wrote, "The guards smile more. We argue less. Something has changed. For the first time, I believe the war may truly end. And when it does, I wonder, what will I carry home? Not the victory I was promised, but the vision of another way of life, a life I have glimpsed through these fences." That vision, fragile but growing, became Bauer's anchor. While others raged or despaired, he clung to the possibility that captivity had given him a strange gift, the chance to see his enemy not as monsters, but as people living a freedom he could barely comprehend. The barbed wire still stood, but in Bauer's mind, it had already begun to rust. Winter settled over the camp like a heavy shroud. Frost crept across the barack windows, and prisoners wrapped themselves in thin blankets, huddling for warmth. Outside, the bare trees stood stark against a gray sky. Yet it was not the cold that bit deepest, it was the rumors that seeped through the wire. By December 1944, word of a massive German counteroffensive in the Ardennes electrified the camp. Some prisoners erupted with pride. "See? The Reich strikes back." They imagined American lines broken, Allied armies thrown into chaos, perhaps even a negotiated peace. For a brief moment, loyalty rekindled in their eyes, the old fire of belief. But Bauer had grown cautious. He remembered the optimism of Stalingrad before it crumbled, the promises of secret weapons that never came. "A last gamble," he whispered to Kruger. "That's all it can be." Within weeks, the truth filtered in. The offensive had stalled. German tanks ran out of fuel. Casualties mounted. The Great Push collapsed under the sheer weight of Allied resources. Newspapers displayed maps with arrows retreating, not advancing. The fire in the Loyalists' eyes guttered, replaced once more by silence. Letters from home carried darker tones now. Bauer's mother wrote of endless bombing raids, of nights spent in cellars, of bread lines stretching down streets. Whole sentences were struck through by censors, leaving only fragments. "Pray you are safe, so many gone, hope this ends soon." The missing words spoke louder than those that remained. Then came whispers at first dismissed as enemy lies, stories of camps, of forced labor, of mass graves. American newspapers pinned to the boards displayed photographs, gaunt faces, skeletal bodies. Prisoners argued furiously. "Propaganda," some shouted. "Impossible. Lies to poison us." Yet Bauer, staring at the hollow eyes in the images, felt something break inside. One evening, during a lecture in the camp's makeshift hall, an American officer spoke plainly, "Your leaders have not only lost this war. They have committed crimes against humanity itself." The room bristled with denial, but beneath the surface, doubt spread like rot. If even half of what they heard was true, then their entire foundation of loyalty, honor, and sacrifice had been built on sand. Bauer returned to his bunk shaken. He thought of the comrades he had lost, the men who had marched beside him into Russia, the friends who would never return. Had they died for a lie? He stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind claw at the barracks, and realized he could not answer. The Americans, sensing the prisoners' turmoil, doubled their efforts at re-education. They showed films, grainy reels of ruined cities, of survivors stumbling out of camps. Some prisoners shouted at the screen, unable to accept it. Others wept quietly. Bauer watched in silence, his chest tightening. He remembered his own arrogance, his certainty that Germany's destiny was carved in stone. And now he saw only rubble where that destiny had once stood. Yet life in the camp went on. Work details trudged out each morning, harvesting firewood, repairing fences, clearing snow. The guards joked about Christmas, exchanging gifts. To Bauer's astonishment, the prisoners were given small packages too: cigarettes, chocolate, a sliver of turkey. It was a gesture so absurd, so utterly alien to the brutal world he had known, that he could barely bring himself to touch the food. And yet, as he bit into the chocolate, he felt tears sting his eyes. Even the guards seemed to recognize the prisoners' shifting moods. Some spoke more freely now, asking about families, about villages left behind. One guard, a farmer's son from Iowa, showed Bauer a photograph of his children sledding. Bauer thought of the winters he had spent in Bavaria, the laughter of cousins in the snow. The two men looked at each other, enemies by war, yet somehow mirrors of the same longing. As 1945 dawned, the world beyond the wire unraveled with increasing speed. The Soviets were advancing into Poland. Allied bombers roared overhead daily, their contrails crisscrossing the sky. Every day the newspapers posted in camp carried headlines that struck harder than any bullet. Cologne falls, Rhine crossed, Berlin approaches. Among the prisoners, denial withered. Conversations turned not to victory but to survival. What would happen when the war ended? Would they be shipped home? Would they face trials? Would they even have homes to return to? The questions gnawed at them, unanswerable, each man left to wrestle with his own conscience. One night, Kruger broke the silence in their barack. "If what they say about the camps is true," he murmured, "then we are not soldiers. We are accomplices." No one replied. The words hung in the air like smoke. Bauer lay awake long after, staring at the rafters. He thought of the day he enlisted, the pride in his uniform, the speeches that promised greatness. And he thought of the barbed wire now surrounding him, the chocolate on his tongue, the faces in the photographs on the bulletin board. He could no longer reconcile them. The shadow of collapse had reached the camp, not in bombs or bullets, but in the erosion of certainty. For Bauer, the war was already over, not because the Reich had fallen but because belief itself had died. In his journal he wrote, "They told us we fought for honor. But what honor is left when the world calls us criminals? Perhaps captivity is not my punishment, but my escape, from lies, from illusions, from the weight of a war already lost." And with that, the silence of winter deepened, heavy with the knowledge that everything they had once known was unraveling. Spring of 1945 crept into the camp not with blossoms, but with rumors carried on every wind. The Reich was breaking apart. Cities once declared fortresses had surrendered. The rivers that were supposed to be barriers had been crossed. Each morning the prisoners clustered around the bulletin boards, eyes scanning the maps, watching the arrows of Allied armies converge on the heart of Germany. By March, the truth was undeniable. The fatherland was shrinking to a cage smaller than the one that held them. Cologne had fallen. Frankfurt was next. The Ruhr, once the industrial beating heart of German power, was collapsing into Allied hands. For Bauer, each headline was like a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading through his memories of pride, of marching triumphs, of belief in an invincible Reich. Letters from home grew more desperate. His mother wrote of nights when sirens wailed endlessly, of houses collapsing into fire, of neighbors lost under rubble. Entire passages were censored, black bars hiding words he already knew: hunger, despair, death. He clutched each fragment of her handwriting as if it were a lifeline, but deep inside, he feared he would never see her again. In April, the camp loudspeakers crackled with a voice that stunned them all: reports of Adolf Hitler dead in Berlin. Some prisoners gasped. Others crossed themselves. A few shouted that it was a lie, an American trick. But Bauer stood frozen, staring at the fence, his mind empty. 4 years, every oath, every salute, every sacrifice had been sworn in that man's name. And now gone. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout of denial. The Americans seemed to sense the moment. Guards walked through the barracks without their usual indifference, speaking more softly, almost kindly. They knew the prisoners had just lost not only a leader, but the anchor of their entire world. Bauer found himself wondering if this was what freedom felt like, not banners and parades but the collapse of fear. Soon after, Allied troops reached the camps themselves. Orders came down. The war was over, Germany had surrendered. The announcement spread through the wire like fire. Some prisoners cheered wildly, embracing each other. Others sank onto their bunks, heads in hands. Bauer felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. He was free, yes, but free to return to a home that no longer existed. The gates opened, and with them came a flood of sights Bauer would never forget. Trucks rolled in carrying survivors from concentration camps, skeletal figures with sunken eyes. The prisoners of war, once proud soldiers, stared at these living ghosts and felt their last defenses crumble. No propaganda, no denial could withstand the truth walking before them. For Bauer, the realization was devastating. He thought of every order followed without question, every march into occupied lands, every night spent believing he was serving honor. And now he saw the cost. Not only cities in ruins, not only comrades buried, but millions of innocents consumed by a system he had upheld. Days blurred together as the Americans processed the surrender. Papers were signed, names recorded, arrangements made for repatriation. Bauer waited his turn, sitting on a bench outside the administration tent, watching guards joke with each other, watching survivors shuffle past, watching the flag above the camp ripple in the spring wind. He wrote in his journal one final time: "The Reich is finished. We are finished. Yet I remain alive, fed by my captors, freed by my enemies. What am I now? A soldier without an army, a son without a homeland, a man stripped of every illusion. Perhaps that is what survival means, not victory, not pride, but the chance to begin again. When his name was called, Bauer stepped forward. The gates that had once imprisoned him now stood open, leading not into captivity but into uncertainty. He glanced back once, at the barbed wire, at the watchtowers, at the barracks where he had wrestled with belief and doubt. Strange as it seemed, he realized he might miss them. Within those fences, he had learned more about truth, about humanity, than in all his years of marching under banners. Then he walked through the gate, into the ruins of a world waiting to be rebuilt. The train clattered eastward, each station drawing Bauer closer to the country that no longer resembled the one he had left. He sat with other released prisoners, silent men staring through cracked windows at a landscape scarred by war. Bridges sagged into rivers, houses stood roofless, fields lay untilled. Children with hollow cheeks wandered the platforms begging for scraps when the train slowed. For the first time since capture, Bauer understood what true hunger looked like, and realized that, as a prisoner, he had been shielded from the worst. When he finally stepped onto German soil, the air smelled not of victory but of smoke and ash. His hometown, once proud with its tidy square and church spire, was now half rubble. Streets he had marched down in uniform were blocked by collapsed masonry. The bakery where he had stolen sweets as a boy was gone, nothing but scorched timber. He paused before what remained of his family home, 2 walls standing like gravestones, the rest a blackened heap. Inside, among the ruins, his mother waited. She had survived in a cellar, living on thin soup and the kindness of neighbors who had little to spare. Her hair, once dark, was streaked white. When she saw him, she wept, not with joy but with exhaustion, as though his return was one less burden to carry. Bauer embraced her, feeling bones beneath her skin, and whispered apologies he knew would never be enough. The town itself was a graveyard of illusions. Posters of the Führer still clung to shattered walls, their edges curled, the faces torn. Once they had promised glory, now they looked like sick jokes pasted over ruins. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, glancing around as if the secret police might still be listening, though everyone knew they were gone. Bauer felt the silence heavy in every conversation, the unspoken question. What did you believe and why? In the months that followed, Bauer tried to rebuild some semblance of life. He took work clearing debris from streets, stacking bricks from demolished houses into neat piles for reuse. Each day as he worked beside widows and orphan boys, he felt the weight of their glances. They didn't blame him personally, at least not aloud, but he carried the uniform in his memory, the oaths he had sworn, the battles he had fought. Every stone he lifted was a reminder of what had been destroyed in the name of the Reich. Food was scarce. Bread came in small rations, potatoes more precious than coins. Bauer often recalled the POW camp mess halls, the trays piled high, the waste discarded. The irony cut deep. As a prisoner he had eaten like a man. Free in Germany he lived on scraps. At night he wrote in his journal, "I was warned of American cruelty. Instead they fed me. Now free at home I starve." What victory was this? The Americans occupied nearby towns, their trucks rolling past in columns, their uniforms crisp, their laughter carrying through the ruins. Children chased after them, calling for candy, and sometimes the soldiers tossed chocolate bars or gum from the back of jeeps. Bauer watched, astonished. Once, those men had been his sworn enemies. Now his neighbors smiled at them with gratitude. Slowly, rumors spread that former POWs could apply for work with the occupying forces. Translation, driving trucks, even manual labor paid in rations. Bauer hesitated. To serve the very army he had fought against felt like betrayal. But hunger gnawed sharper than pride. In the end he signed his name. The irony was bitter. Once a soldier of the Reich, now a hired hand of its conquerors. The work brought new revelations. He drove supply trucks for the Americans, delivering crates of food, medicine, and clothing. He saw warehouses filled with abundance, far beyond anything Germany had ever managed during the war. He watched American engineers rebuild bridges in weeks that Germans had declared would take months. He realized the scale of the deception he had lived under, that the weak democracy had in fact crushed them not only with weapons but with sheer productivity. And yet, amid the humiliation, something else stirred in him. The faint hope that perhaps Germany could learn from this abundance, that perhaps life beyond dictatorship was possible. One evening as he parked his truck at a depot, an American guard offered him a cigarette. Bauer hesitated, then accepted. They smoked in silence, two former enemies sharing nothing but the glow of tobacco in the dark. For the first time, Bauer did not feel hatred. Only weariness and the strange sense that the guard, too, wished only to move past the ruins. At home, his mother clung to old prayers, lighting candles in the shell of the church each Sunday. Bauer accompanied her, though his faith had long since cracked. In the broken arches and missing roof, he found a different kind of truth, that survival was less about belief in gods or leaders and more about the stubborn will to endure. By winter, snow covered the ruins, softening their jagged edges. Bauer walked the streets, journal in hand, recording what he saw. Children sledding on mounds of rubble, women hanging laundry on shattered walls, men rebuilding brick by brick. It was not glory, not empire, not destiny. It was survival. And perhaps he thought that was enough. Years passed before Bauer could write about his captivity without trembling. Yet when he finally reread the journals he had kept, the ink faded, the paper creased, he realized they were not simply the record of a prisoner but of a transformation. He had entered the wire with blind obedience, filled with propaganda's poison, and walked out carrying seeds of doubt that would grow into something far larger. The POW camps had not been paradise. Barbed wire still cut the horizon, guards still carried rifles, homesickness still gnawed every night. But within that fence Bauer had witnessed something his own leaders could never manufacture: the quiet strength of a society built on freedom. He had seen guards share cigarettes with prisoners, officers allow worship in foreign tongues, teachers arrive to instruct men who yesterday had been enemies. He had eaten meals richer than German civilians could dream of, not because of charity, but because American farms and factories could simply produce that much. For Bauer, the greatest shock had not been kindness or abundance, but the casualness of it. The Americans did not strut about declaring their superiority. They wasted food without thinking, left lights burning when rooms were empty, handed out chocolate to children as if it grew on trees. This lack of fear, this ease with prosperity, revealed a power more enduring than tanks or bombers. It was a society confident enough to treat enemies with dignity because it had nothing to fear from the truth. When he returned to Germany, the ruins confirmed the lesson. Dictatorship had promised strength but delivered ashes. Propaganda had promised victory but delivered starvation. Freedom, once mocked as weakness, had built armies that spanned oceans and industries that dwarfed empires. The evidence lay in every American warehouse, every bridge rebuilt, every family fed. Bauer was not alone in this realization. Across Europe, tens of thousands of former POWs carried similar memories home. Of warm meals in Texan mess halls, of laughter at prisoner concerts, of books read in makeshift classrooms. Some would never speak of it, ashamed that their first true glimpse of humanity had come from the enemy. But others would share their stories quietly around kitchen tables, in letters to friends, in lessons to their children. These stories mattered. They helped erode the myths that had chained Germany to its past. They whispered of a different path, where strength came not from domination but from cooperation, where dignity was not granted by rank but by birth. For a generation shattered by war, such whispers were the first breath of democracy. Bauer himself never became a politician, nor a public figure. He worked as a mechanic, married a schoolteacher, and raised 2 children among the ruins slowly turning into towns again. But in small ways he lived the lesson he had learned behind barbed wire. He never forbade his children from asking questions. He never silenced a neighbor for disagreeing. He never forgot that even enemies deserved dignity because once he had been one. Sometimes, late at night, he would tell his son about Texas. About the wide skies and the hum of tractors. About coffee with sugar and bread so white it looked like clouds. About American guards leaning on fences, chatting with the very men they were supposed to fear. His son would listen wide-eyed as though hearing a fairy tale. And perhaps Bauer thought it was a fairy tale come true, not of conquest but of kindness. The memory stayed with him until his final days, the moment he walked through the camp gates at last, free not only of barbed wire but of illusions. Behind him lay the ruins of an empire built on fear. Ahead lay the long, uncertain work of rebuilding, brick by brick, trust by trust. And though he carried scars, he also carried proof that even in the darkest times, freedom could shine through fences. That was the legacy of the POW camps in America. They did not merely hold men, they transformed them. They showed enemies that democracy was not weakness but resilience. They proved that prosperity was not hoarded by elites, but shared by ordinary workers driving tractors and welding ships. They revealed that the greatest weapon in war might not be the bomb or the rifle, but the ability to turn captives into witnesses of a better way. For Bauer, and for thousands like him, captivity became a paradox. A prison that opened doors, a defeat that planted the seeds of renewal. When they looked back years later, many called those camps a paradise. Not because they were comfortable, though some were. Not because they were free, though kindness often made them feel so. But because within those fences, they glimpsed a possibility they had never imagined. That dignity could survive even in war, that enemies could become teachers, and that freedom was stronger than fear. Bauer died an old man, his journal tucked in a drawer, its pages yellowed. At his funeral, his children read a passage he had written on his first day of freedom. I was a prisoner but I have seen freedom. I was defeated but I have tasted abundance. I was lied to but I have learned the truth. Let this be enough. And perhaps for him it was.